Hello everyone, my name is Anitsu, and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today is going to be a rather interesting video, and I'll apologize in advance for its length because there's a lot on this subject that I want to say, because it is a subject that kind of is something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of the overall health of the game, and kind of just sorting through my perspectives on why I really, and I mean really, do not like the training option cards and the Scramble styled cards. So here's a quick disclaimer: you don't necessarily have to agree with my opinions, these are just my opinions, and if you want, you could even have a civil discussion with me about all of this down in the comments below, and I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below when it comes to this subject matter, because there's going to be a lot that I'm going to be discussing. So here's just the quick disclaimer on just some general stuff before we begin. So while we're in this phase, if you like this kind of content and want to see more of it, feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date for whenever I upload or go live next. Let's start off before we even get into training and Scramble cards and those style of options. Let's start by talking about deck building. Digimon has a finite number of spaces when it comes to how we build decks. We have a total of 50 cards in our deck, which seems like it's a decent number. It's about average when it comes to most TCGs at this point, it feels like, or just in the middle. It still means that we have to be deliberate about what we're actually going to be putting inside of our decks. So when we're putting a card inside of our deck, there's going to be a specific purpose that card is trying to fulfill. This means whenever we're running a card, there's going to have to be something that we're not running as a result. So that kind of goes into why certain games like side decking, so that way it kind of expands the pool of cards in which a deck is able to compete with, especially in games of best of 3, but Digimon doesn't have that, and I don't necessarily think Digimon needs it, because Digimon's already tried that before, and I still don't think that the game is balanced in a way to where side decking is actually going to be meaningful or beneficial for everyone involved. Certain decks are going to be able to side deck way better than other decks, and Bandai would have to retry how to accomplish a good side deck, and I think that's effort Bandai really and clearly just doesn't want to put in towards the game at this point. So when it comes to actual deck building, the very first thing you should be thinking about when it comes to building your deck is, what is your win condition? And then obviously put in cards that are going to synergize and support and get you to that win condition as quickly as it possibly can. And that's part of the key element, is speed. Obviously, Digimon is a game that already heavily incentivizes aggressive strategies, especially as the game progresses and moves faster and faster. If you actually stop and think about the systems and mechanics that are in place, there's a very easy reason why aggressive strategies tend to do well over more defensive and control-y style strategies. And that also goes into the different play styles in terms of how decks are built and how we're going to be playing said decks. So when it comes to Digimon deck building, we have about 2 or 3 main ways that we're approaching deck building. The first one, which is the most classic way to play Digimon, is stack-based design. So going from like a level 2 all the way up to a level 6 or 7, not necessarily trying to skip as many stages because you want to optimize on your abilities as much as possible. So that's going to cover the vast majority of what Digimon decks are. Then you have decks that like to hard play Digimon at reduced costs, and then you have decks that are relying on tamers to be able to do other things to try to support it, so you're going to be playing a higher tamer count when it comes to that third style, and then you could do different things with said tamer based on the abilities that those tamers are going to be utilizing. Those are just kind of the initial ways that we're going to be playing the game and how decks are built, and this is all important into how these option cards have impacted and affected the game. So in most TCGs, especially in larger events, or in like online rank systems in online play, you're not realistically going to be able to build towards every single strategy. So this kind of incentivizes you to always want to run your best version of the deck, even if it means that you're sacrificing the ability to try to counter a counter, and it's just more advantageous to play accelerants, which are cards that are going to be supporting your strategy, rather than deterrents, which are going to be cards to try to disrupt your opponent's strategy. So usually we only are going to be running deterrents if we have the necessary deck spaces to run it, because we have enough free slots to kind of just figure out whatever we want to do. But again, half the time those slots are just better off towards accelerants rather than deterrents, so that way you can make your deck move as quickly as possible to get to that win condition. So due to all of this match variance, you reasonably can't counter for everything. And again, that's kind of where certain games can leverage sideboards to try to figure that out. But again, Digimon's not a game that does that. So because you can't counter everything, you run the risk where deterrents actually start becoming bricks, because they're not serving the purpose in which they're going to be serving, because they're serving the purpose for that specific matchup. And if you don't see that matchup, then the card literally just doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So that's why, like, from a gameplay perspective, it's always better to run accelerants, because 100% of the time that card's going to be meaningful, whereas a deterrent, it won't 100% of the time be something meaningful that you're actually running. And because of that, you're wasting deck spaces on deterrents when, again, it's just easier and better to run accelerants. And that's kind of where a lot of Digimon deck building currently is we basically cut out as many deterrents as we possibly can, and we're just going full Unga Bunga accelerants. And when a game prints too many accelerants, then that kind of becomes its own little problem. And you run the risk of homogenizing your game as a result, because now a lot of decks are basically running the same basic set of tools to be able to functionally play the game against one another and against other styles of play that are moving potentially just as fast or faster than what your little homogenized package is doing. So in Digimon, there are a couple of different types of options that we have seen in the game. Removal being the most prominent secondary type of one outside of, you know, these delayed based cards. And there are other ones that we generally do sometimes run. And it's not like those options are bad. You just have to stop and think, do I want to make my deck worse 90% of the games where I'm running a card that just isn't helping my overall game plan and is designed to try to slow the opponent down in specific situations? Or do I just take that 10% risk and auto concede if I'm unable to try to counter what the opponent is trying to do in those few specific instances? So that's a meaningful decision that you have to conscientiously think about. And some people, that 10% is worth the risk, and for others, that 10% isn't worth the risk. It really just depends on the context and situation that you're trying to play and prep for. So having to make that deck building decision then really puts a lot of pressure on the deck slots in order to be as optimized as possible. So for a lot of decks in Digimon, it's actually more optimal to pretend that the opponent doesn't have any way to actually meaningfully counter what you're trying to do with either their protection effects, floodgates, or just various other tech cards. This allows you to further your actual game plan for that other 90% of the time to make winning that 90% even easier. And the opponent is also going to have to make that same decision. So if the opponent is in that same type of a category, then we're just running less and less of, let's just say, the floodgates to try to stop and slow down what the opponent's doing. So we're just putting full pedal to the metal and it's all gas all the time. Digimon already has lots of variance as is, and it also has lots of consistency as is too. And this is why we try to reduce the amount of variance with trying to increase as much consistency as we possibly can, even if it costs us the risk of running into the counters. But again, if the opponent already has to think about that, and the opponent is also thinking about how to get to their game plan faster, then they're most likely not going to be running those types of counters anyway, unless they're already built into their deck. So yeah, we're just doubling down on accelerants to try to end the game as quickly as possible. And these types of cards, yes, do accomplish that goal, but at a huge cost to the overall game. The best decks, as I kind of already alluded to, already tend to have answers built into them without really needing to sacrifice much deck space for, you know, running those answer cards like other decks. And that's kind of what's right now starting to separate good decks from bad decks is, does your deck actually have those answers built in, and how much deck space are you going to have to dedicate to running those answers if you are going to be running any at all? So while these cards, and by these cards I mean the trainings and scrambles and memory boosts and the like of those, so while these cards might allow people to brew better off meta decks, the problem is the poor kind of just stay poor because the rich get richer. So even though technically the poor get richer, the rich also get richer too, so it's not really shrinking the power gap between the decks. And like, if that's the whole goal of what these cards are supposed to do, is try to put everything on a more even playing field, well, I hate to say it, in my perspective, they're obviously not doing that job. There's ways to have accomplished that based on how Digimon could have designed specific cards, and we're kind of trying to see that now with some of what they're doing with the more wider archetypical design that they've been trying to experiment with, but that's still in their experimental phase, and it's not exactly caught up to where the rest of the game actually is, which is why the last couple of sets has felt a little bit underpowered compared to where we currently still are. Let's now start actually diving into these cards. Let's get into the option that started it all. So the option that started it all was the promo memory boosts. And I have to say promo memory boosts because we did get a couple of other memory boosts alongside of these, but those were more like thought experiment cards on what they can do with delayed based abilities. So whenever I'm going to say memory boost, I'm more specifically talking about the promo memory boosts. But the basic idea behind the promo memory boost was actually really good for the game overall, because again, not only did it open up design space for more things to kind of be played around with, especially when it comes to how delayed based effects trigger, what you're able to gain out of delays, what you're able to utilize their mains for, what their security effects are doing. There's a lot of intricacies that go into how these cards could be designed. And I think that was really cool for the game, and what memory boosts more specifically were doing for the game was actually trying to fix the consistency issue, because there was still, by the time these cards were released all the way back in BT6, a decent amount of consistency issues, and we didn't necessarily have as hyper-optimized of decks, so we actually had space to run these and other cards, and that was overall a net positive for the game. That kind of just leads us into the dangers of delayed based options, because they kind of have just ruined the entire game when it came to options and how we think about options and the options that they printed going forward. We just saw this basically death of the normal option, and if your option didn't have a delayed effect, then you kind of just weren't thinking about it unless it was a very hyper-specific option covering a very specific niche purpose. So we were seeing these types of options that were either super cheap and easy to use, had a very specific purpose, so no other effect in the game could do what this card was doing. The value proposition was way too good to ignore when it came to utilizing that option, or all of the above. So if your option that wasn't a delayed based ability wasn't doing one of those 3 or technically 4 things, it basically was rendered completely irrelevant, which I think is really sad, because that just warped the entire game around this specific ability and how we're going to be utilizing and implementing it. So now let's start getting into some of the problem childs. So the training cards, what do they actually do? So the big TLDR, if you don't actually feel like reading the card, is basically they're going to allow you to dig for basically any card of the color of the option that you're utilizing. And then the delay ability basically is banked evolution because it'll reduce the cost of that Digivolution when you utilize this next. So this card is obviously similarly designed as what you previously read with the memory boost cards, because the memory boost cards basically is banked memory and more consistency, which is the two things that this card is doing as well. But the big difference is the cost. Obviously these training cards cost less, and the refund is a little bit different. So while the idea behind the memory boosts was to help fix a consistency issue with the game, we have to remember when these cards came out. So mental training, physical training, all of the other trainings, they came out in BT14. And BT14, the new thing that they were trying to push was rookies with a ability that happens at the start of the main, which means we raise the rookie out of our raising area, and then we're able to then get this start of main ability to get even more value out of our cards. So this card was designed to specifically interact with that type of ability. And it's not necessarily specifically locked to this type of ability, it's just trying to increase the effectiveness and potentness of basically stack-based decks. Decks that are going to be then digivolving up the chain. Because previously, before these types of cards, we weren't necessarily always raising as a rookie. We sometimes would play and raise champions and even ultimate level Digimon, depending on the situations that we were put in and so on. So these cards came and changed that dynamic to where now it actually is optimal to raise your rookie, which means you're getting even more value, not only out of the new style of rookies that they were printing, but out of essentially everything as well. So now that the training cards exist, we are now also gaining the abilities of not only the level 3s, but the level 4s, and then therefore the level 5s, and it just makes things cheaper and easier because, again, this is a banked evolution. So when it comes to the dangers of these cards, supposedly designed to make things even worse because it would allow for more explosive turns to exist, being more combo heavy and combo-esque, especially since we already had memory boosts. So now this kind of created a banked memory system where we essentially are just sitting here utilizing these options, banking our memory, and then we're going to move out, use up all of our resources, then potentially kill the opponent in one big turn. So that kind of incentivizes these big high-level floodgates with protection effects, so that way the opponent can't really interact with them, or just using big OTK combos to just kill the opponent outright in a single turn, completely invalidating basically everything that happened prior to that turn. And because the only other actions that you're doing outside of that combo is literally just trying to play trainings and memory boosts to find all of your combo pieces, it really didn't lead to interesting gameplay. So, as I kind of alluded to, what makes trainings a little bit on the extra broken side, especially in comparison to memory boosts, is the fact that it is a 100% refund. Memory boosts do not give you a 100% refund. So the more you have to invest in a card, the more you're going to therefore give the opponent. So if, let's just say, my opponent put me to 1 and I'm forced to use a memory boost, that puts the opponent at 2, then they can get an evolution and do some other stuff or set some other things up. So it really has a better dynamic when cards like this cost more, because there actually is a risk involved to them. When you minimize the cost of that card, you minimize the risk that card also presents and gives. So now that you're running the combination, not only is your deck more consistent than ever, but you're also not necessarily playing with the memory system, kind of invalidating it in a sense. So these cards are very clearly warping the decks to be focused on speed and unplayability and uninteractability as much as they possibly can be. And I find that to be pretty unfortunate, because that just forces power creep everywhere else, because if this is the most effective tactic available, or the meta, then everything else is going to have to be forced to adapt or die to it. And this kind of led to the Scramble cards being introduced into the game. Digimon is really weird with how they handle promos because they design promos basically in a vacuum separate from how they design sets, and you can clearly see how broken and pushed some of the promos actually are because of this type of design philosophy or mentality that they seem to find themselves in. So essentially, what do the Scrambles do? Scrambles are basically a net 1 on saving your memory. So you're never going to use this card, or you're rarely going to be using this card to Digivolve for 2, when you could bank a free memory and basically use it like a Hammer Spark and just Digivolve for 2 when the card initially costed 3. So it's already starting to try to break the resource system of the game, on top of the fact that the delayed effect is incredibly powerful, allowing you to essentially replace your draw with any of the Digimon that are in your trash, on top of the fact that you also get to play a low-level Digimon as well if you meet another specific condition. So it's really, really strong, because this card was designed to try to be a comeback mechanic in a sense, where it's making games less one-sided, because if you get blown out by the opponent's unable to kill you. Well, if you have a Scramble set up, then you basically get a Digimon back, you get an extra card back, and you could try to fight back against said opponent, especially in certain situations where Scrambles reward more specific decks than others, even though they are just generically good to use. But again, similarly to trainings, Scrambles are not without their dangers that Bandai really didn't seem to think about or understand when they made these cards. So this just further pushes even more aggressive styles of play, because now you have a failsafe in case you are blown out after you use your big combo. Whereas before it was supposed to be a comeback mechanic in case you were losing, now we're using it in case we're winning to try to win even more or put us in more advantageous situations to be even more aggressive. And the other big factor that goes into how we can utilize this card to make it even more powerful than what it was probably intended for is just all of the different ways that we actually can utilize this card. Because there's certain warp effects, we could use it with other cost reductions, we could even reduce the cost of this option. We could play it with lower statted, higher level Digimon than what was intended. Rush can be easier abused, and there's just a multitude of different ways to actually break all of the different abilities that are going on with this card that I don't necessarily think Bandai particularly thought of. And I'm not blaming them for not thinking about it, I just blame them for not thinking harder about how a card like this would impact the game. So the other big thing is basically any color outside of white are able to use these types of cards because there's one in each color, similar to the memory boosts and the training cards. So the other big danger that this card presents is the fact that you get to grab back any Digimon card out of your trash, like from its delay ability. Yes, it replaces your card draw, but who cares, because it basically ignores the limited list. And cards are put on the limited list for a particular reason, because they don't want you using it over and over again, and that becomes highly problematic when it comes to how and why these cards are limited in the first place. So this card single-handedly basically nullifying that limitation on a card, more specifically Digimon card, only needing to be seen once, kinda is a little on the silly side, especially since a lot of decks in a lot of colors, and there's a lot of different strategies and mechanics that are interacting with the trash and setting up the trash, so it makes it even easier to churn and burn through our deck, set up our trash, and then utilize these cards to kind of just grab back and reuse whatever we needed, limited or not. And it's not like Bandai is actually stopping or slowing down on printing more of these generic staples. We're getting them in a couple of different forms. One of those forms is going to be, well, two-colored memory boosts. So the only real problem that two-colored memory boost introduces is just more consistency on having that ability to search for any one particular color. So now let's just say you have a single color deck. Now it has like, what, 3+ different memory boosts that it could possibly run. So I think that's a little bit on the ridiculous side, especially since these are supposed to try to help two-color decks, which have been struggling in the past to actually try to catch up. So it's not necessarily shrinking the power gap between monocolored decks and multicolored decks. But at least, like, the bright side of it is it's still a memory boost, so it's not as broken as training cards. And the other big thing is if you're forcing everyone to play memory boosts, well, in a deck of 12 memory boosts, now that gives players actually more of a particular reason to run a proper floodgate to try to stop or stall these types of effects, because now they're not scattered between 2 or 3 different style of ways to cheat on memory. So that way we actually can try to put some level of counterplay back into deck building. And speaking of deck building, we also are getting a new kind of generic staple where it is Digital Gate Open. So this is a card that does resemble a lot of what memory boosts are trying to do, except this card is white, so it's not searchable by trainings or by other color specific cards. So that's kind of like a little bit of a balancing tool, but the fact that it's still a consistency tool is really good. This time they open it up to be able to add tamers as well, so you could potentially hit 2 cards off of this, which is really good levels of consistency. But again, the counterbalance is the fact that it costs a decent chunk of memory. So yes, you do get to essentially get up to a 100% refund with the tamer cost reduction when it comes to its delay ability, but that's an up to, so not all the time for all decks is it actually going to play a 4 or more costed tamer. Sometimes you just need to get a 3 costed tamer on the field, and well, now you essentially paid 4 to, yes, search your deck, but then set up that 3 costed tamer, or even a 2 costed tamer. It doesn't matter, it's just whatever you're going to be wanting to play, and that'll vary based on the deck. But the fact that a lot of decks can take advantage of this is very good, but the fact that it's not overly broken in terms of what it's offering when it comes to not only its searching but its delay ability is very, very good, on top of the security ability also being a really substantial effect, but also not putting itself onto the field, so that way you actually still have to manually set this card up. It is a really good example of a well-designed card, but Bandai still has to be very, very careful when it comes to this style of design, because yes, it still comes with its own set of pitfalls and risks, because they really have to now watch what they're making when it comes to tamers, but because tamers is a smaller subset of cards compared to the different card types that they make on a set-by-set basis, it's going to be a little bit easier to watch and manage because of that. But again, it also limits the design space in which they're able to explore when it comes to tamers because of this card existing. So it does have its own pros and cons, not only from a deck building perspective, but an overarching game design perspective. And kind of, again, the big takeaway is I don't necessarily think this card is overly broken because of the initial cost that you're putting into it, because again, 4 memory versus 3 memory versus 2 memory is just a big deal as memory gets more and more efficient when it comes to how we're playing the game, because 1 memory could mean very much a lot depending on the matchup and the deck that you're playing against. So let's jump into a couple of examples to see how deck building has actually evolved because of each of these different style of cards. So I'm going to be using an example that I have a good amount of experience with, and we also have a lot of data with, and that's going to be Mirage, but it's a very easy one because anyone could go look at the data and be like, okay, what was Mirage doing when this card existed? So let's start with BT13. So BT13, this was one of the last known topping Mirage lists. All of these deck lists that I'm going to be showing were taken from Eggman Events, so feel free to check out his website if you really want to. Other deck building databases, you could go back into like Digimon CG Guide, and they have it separated by all their formats. Same thing with Digimon Meta, and again, you could see for yourself how the game has changed when it came to deck building and what these cards have done to the game, more specifically the memory boost, training, scrambles. But you could see that we had space for removal. We also had a little bit more room for a couple more tamers, because again, the consistency wasn't necessarily as high. We had room for various other tech cards, so you could kind of see, like, yes, we were starting to slim and trim down our decks a little bit when it came to how stack-based decks worked, but there still was plenty of deck building and deck space for various different things, because not all the BT13 iterations of this deck were running memory boosts at 4 copies. Some of them were running them at 2 copies. They were still a good card nonetheless, but we had other styles of play that we were taking advantage of, like searching rookies, and we also had various other tamers that we could potentially run for subsequent added card draw or for various utility purposes. So if we move forward to BT14, which is when we got the training cards, we could start to see that removal has been taken out, other utility cards has been taken out, and some tech cards has been taken out. And again, we could see that, hey, here's the start of main phase rookie ability. But you could see that, again, like Digimon count wise, it really wasn't any like very noticeable difference. Some decks did like to trim even further the fat, because some would be running 4 and 4. It really just depends on what list you're looking, but again, you could see because of these cards, it's an immediate 4 of, it has immediate impact with some of the other cards that we're running, and yeah, it created a very noticeable speed and tempo shift that certain decks in the game weren't able to keep up with. So this takes us to pre-ban and restriction list for Mirage, which was when the Scrambles were kind of introduced. They were introduced at a really weird time, so I just basically pulled data from Special Booster 2.0 and EX8 before this deck really got hit. And again, you could see the shifts in design in which we were actually utilizing these cards. So you could see no removal options in the option space at all. You could see some of the shifts in some of the Digimons. You could even see a downgrade in how many tamers we were running to fit in more consistency cards. We did still have a little tiny bit of space for like some miscellaneous tech, but that's mostly because we were relying on solely maybe 1 or 2 cards to really do a lot of the heavy lifting, and we also had a support card to actually be able to utilize these tech cards. But effectively, the way that the deck is developed, the rookies mattered a little bit less, but again, because of the scrambles, we were actually kind of able to utilize them in some new and interesting ways. On top of still, we're utilizing the start of main type of abilities with the training cards. But you could see this big shift from each of the different iterations of the deck as these cards got introduced to basically just running more and more combo-focused gameplay. Like, let me get to my combo, let me do my combo, I only need to do it once, and then I kind of just win the game on the spot. And that's the game. And that's currently the game that we're still kind of playing. So this kind of goes down to resource systems being incredibly important. So when a game has a resource system, the whole point of it existing is because it is a tool for designers to use to actually balance their cards against and try to keep the game as fair and engaging as possible. So cards cost a specific amount for a reason, and the second you start negating that cost is when balance basically goes out the window, and it becomes harder and harder to balance things and make those necessary adjustments, as it's only leading to rapid power creep, as we kind of just saw. Like, currently in the game, turn 2 OTKs is kind of just the normal that a lot of decks are trying to strive for. And we're only doing that because we're effectively invalidating the resource system by either having access at too much free resources, or we're just banking everything to lead to one big explosive turn, and it's just how quickly can you put your pieces together and how much stuff did you bank before you made your big push. So with Digimon, all these ways that we have to gain memory, reduce the cost, only sped up the game. And I'm not saying that it's not fine. Games are going to always evolve, but we have to think more conscientiously about how things are evolving. Because if essentially one of the most interesting aspects of Digimon compared to every other TCG on the market, and the most unique defining thing about it is the resource system being how memory works, then that basically going away kind of makes the game not necessarily feel like it's itself anymore. And I'm not saying that we can't have cards that basically play other cards out for free. I'm just saying we should be using it, or Digimon should be using it, more sparsely. And one of the big taboos that Bandai seem to have broken is ignoring the resource system, because, you know, when you make an action, that action should have a cost associated to it. So anytime that we're actually gaining resources for an action that generally should cost us resources is something that really should not be a thing in the game, because that's going to be something that obviously players are going to be abusing, and it doesn't feel fun and engaging watching somebody basically do all of these different things because they don't cost anything to do, or they're gaining resources to do even more things. So, as a result, what is the actual impact that these cards have on the game? And taking a look at a little bit of the macro level state of the game and the impact these delayed based options had on it, outside of the aforementioned rapid power creep putting a lot of stress and strain on other cards and decks and playstyles, trying to keep up with what these cards are offering for the more traditional style of play, right now the game has a really big goldfishing problem. So if anyone's actually unfamiliar with the term goldfishing, it's basically the same concept as solitaire decks, where you're just going to sit there, do your big combo, play all your cards, do all your interactions. It's going to take more than, obviously, a minute or two. And the opponent might as well just be a goldfish or non-existent. So it doesn't necessarily lead to the most riveting or engaging of gameplays, because we're just trying to minimize the risk. And while that is a good thing, because the amount of removal on everything is so high, it actually incentivizes us, and it's a lot easier, safer, and smarter to just essentially give the opponent really nothing to interact with. So we're just going to sit there and bank all of our future potential for a single turn, rendering the majority of the actions of the actual game to be kind of irrelevant, especially since this only incentivizes big combo plays. And as we can see, there's a lot of decks that are able to do like really big super splashy combos, and the ones that are doing like better than others are the ones that have, again, built-in tools to handle what the rest of the meta is currently presenting, on top of the fact that it actually needs to have the kill power to actually end the game. Otherwise, you're going to explode, do your big combo, and then the opponent could just explode, do their big combo, and theirs is bigger and better and actually can win the game. So it really just takes away your potential at a comeback. So there's a lot of ways that the game has tried to limit or reduce the amount of interactions that you could have with the opponent, and these cards are definitely a big proprietor of it, especially since the most common way to play the game is stack-based decks, just building up your evolutions. So with this being the foundation for how we play, if this is the bar that a lot of other decks and playstyles are going to have to try to clear, again, it doesn't necessarily paint the best picture, because they're going to have to do similar style of things just a little bit differently, but the end result is still just trying to give as little to the opponent to interact with as humanly possible. And that's kind of just what's going on right now. So we essentially are reducing the amount of skill because of this whole shift in dynamic on how we're playing the game, because you essentially just need to learn how your deck's combo works and how to optimize your searching, and you don't really need to know a whole lot about matchups. I mean, matchups are still important. I'm not saying that it's not, but it definitely reduces the amount of knowledge that you actually need, especially if you're not giving the opponent any room or space to have any kind of interactions. So yeah, it just doesn't necessarily paint the best light of where the game's current direction is in my perspective. And Bandai seems to be trying to mitigate this to a degree because they're designing decks that are not necessarily taking full advantage of these cards or are able to take full advantage of these cards for various different purposes. And they're trying to keep things a little bit more archetype locked, which is where the game kind of should have been to begin with, but the game is still trying to figure out what it wants out of itself, especially since the game still also feels like it doesn't fully understand what it wants out of itself and what kind of game it wants to end up being. So, would the game be better off with these cards being banned and limited? In my opinion, yes. Simple answer, yes. If these cards were to leave the game, I think the game would be healthier overall. I do think that there is going to be some issues if these cards were to just magically leave, because they've been designing around these cards and they've been designing substitutes and replacements to these cards for other decks that don't necessarily have them. But I think that like a good ban and restriction update on top of these cards just completely being eradicated would actually bring the game back to some reasonably good, healthy states. But this brings the ultimate question of, do I actually think that this is going to happen? No. Pandora's box has already been opened. Bandai very clearly likes these types of cards, otherwise they wouldn't be making more of them. But that's just what Bandai wants. Right now, there is a lot of other things wrong with the TCG. And this is kind of just me rambling and trying to explain my mindset and frustration with these cards and the impact that they had on the game at large. And this is something, as these cards were introduced, that has been on my mind for quite a while. And that's why I'm making this video, is to lament on some of my frustrations that these cards have had. Whether you share these frustrations, whether this actually makes these frustrations more tangible for others, that's cool. Again, this is just me being me, a guy on the internet. It doesn't necessarily mean I think that the game is bad or the game is dying or anything. I just wanted to state what I think is a big part on what is currently not necessarily the most kosher thing in the Digimon TCG. I'm not saying we should go back to basically BT5 before all of this even happened. No, that's not what I'm saying. If that's the big takeaway, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I think like the game is still in a phase where it's trying to grow and learn to be what it wants to be, and it's still trying to find itself. And while it's still trying to find itself, this is the opportunity to try to voice some concerns, to try to put the game back on a better directional path, so that way we can have a better future than turn 2 OTKs being the best thing in the game. And a lot of decks are achieving that more and more as power creep continues to escalate. So that's all I really have for this video. I know this one was a bit of a doozy, but it's a subject that has been on my mind and I just needed to get it out. So thank you everyone for listening, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Later.